Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please take your seats, our program will begin in 3 minutes.
Good evening and welcome to the Acton building and to this evening's program, co-sponsored tonight, of course, between Acton Institute and the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Now, Jeff and I were meeting some weeks back, and we said we should look for ways to work together, which we both believe is a rather good idea. We do, after all, share the commitments to the same principles, or shall we say the permanent things which have prospered Western civilization, and we have a formidable common enemy, an all-consuming Leviathan, which in our various complementary ways we are working to slay. So here we are this evening, and we're glad you are here. Now, I won't steal much of Jeff's thunder in describing the Kirk Center, headquartered north of here, Piety Hill, where the intellectual giant Russell Kirk wrote 30-plus books, including his magnum opus, The Conservative Mind. He and his wife, the incomparable Annette Kirk, who I know is here, hello Annette, raised 4 beautiful daughters at Piety Hill and began to welcome intellectual pilgrims from around the world. Now, Russell was already a legend when Acton Institute was founded here in Grand Rapids in 1990. And it was natural that Acton extended an invitation to Russell to serve on our advisory board. And it was a terrific honor that he accepted this invitation, along with other invitations to engage with Acton, including welcoming staff to Piety Hill and public lectures here under our aegis. It is worth noting that Russell's last public lecture he delivered to a sold-out Acton audience on the topic, Lord Acton on Revolution, which I commend to you and is available from our bookshop. The Acton-Kirk connection goes deeper still. Within our first months, we hired a receptionist, Acton employee number 3, a Miss Monica Kirk, Russell and Annette's oldest daughter. Not long after that, we hired a smart young budding intellectual as employee number 4. His name was Jeff Nelson. Now, Jeff worked for Acton for a year, which is why I will take credit for all his subsequent successes in his professional life, including a stint as a college president, founder, and manager of a book publishing imprint, and executive vice president of one of the most illustrative classical liberal organizations, ISI, founded by none other than William F. Buckley. And did I mention that somewhere along the way, he met, fell in love, and married Russell and Annette's second daughter, Cecilia, who is also here somewhere tonight, Cecilia. And that brings me full circle to the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, which was in fact co-founded by Jeff and Annette Kirk. And after many successful years, decades, under Annette's successful day-to-day management, Jeff now leads the Kirk Center as its executive director and CEO. Now, our format this evening will include a 30-minute lecture, followed by an opportunity for questions from the audience. At the appropriate time, colleagues of mine will emerge with microphones, and we ask that you beckon them over and speak into the mic so that our digital audience, tonight we're being simulcast, can fully participate in the discussion. So I have given short shrift to tonight's important topic and indeed to its speaker, but I leave this important duty to Jeff Nelson. Would you please join me in welcoming Jeff? Sir?
He just said he didn't praise me enough in terms of my early contributions to the Acton Institute. And that's Chris. Now's not the time, but that day will come. I'm, as you can tell, very used to following Chris Maurin. I've been, in a very broad sense, doing it now for 3 decades. As he said, he was my first boss in the conservative liberty movement. And he's not lying when he says that he can take credit for whatever, I may have accomplished in the liberty movement since I left Acton, because I learned so much from Chris from those early days about how, effective, humane organizations are built, and how you deal with employees, and all these things were new to me. I was an academic. And learning the connection between the financial, the administration, the operational side of building a world-class organization. And when I started in Kirk and Chris's apartment above a flower shop, and we had great times talking, and occasionally some good moments out on the golf course. And it's been wonderful to be friends for all these years, and to see, because Chris, I don't need to tell you here in Grand Rapids, who support the Acton Institute, that he is one of the great institutional and organizational entrepreneurs of his generation. He and Father Sirico built a wonderful and highly significant organization in just 3 decades plus, and now Chris at the helm. I know they're going to do so much more and build on the great foundation that Chris and Father Sirico built. So it's a privilege to be here at the Acton Institute. We do share so many friends and ideas and in common, and to be in this partnership, and now to meet new Actonians or new to hear people. I'm grateful to Colette for organizing this, and Steve Barrows and John Pinheiro for helping us put everything together. So it's a terrific team here, and the Kirk Center crew is glad to be here as well. As they mentioned Annette and Cecilia, but we have the Kirk Center's very first Director of Events and Programs here tonight, Emily Corwin, who is her very first day on the job. So we talked about sort of humane management that I learned for Chris. I need to put it into practice now over the next many months, but she's a real pro, and it's great to have her and all of you here together tonight. It's a kind of, we're a family of friends of freedom, and we have different emphases and different traditions, but it's important that we work together in this day and age, especially where within the liberty movement, things are fraying in a variety of troublesome directions. And I think the Kirk tradition of conservatism and the Acton tradition of classical liberalism, friendly to conservatism, really have a lot of opportunity to forge an important connections together. And so I look forward to exploring those more as I'm now back in this part of the world, and happy to be after 3 decades. Well, we're all here, and many of us are here tonight, and we all understand, we're here because we understand, that to move forward and through our various programmatic interests, we must explore fresh educational approaches and initiatives aimed at renewing America's tradition of economic, political, and religious liberty. That's why we've come here tonight. I think this is probably hopefully, I think it's one of the most interesting and suggestive and hopefully most important Martin Luther King Day events in Grand Rapids today, maybe in quite some time, to explore the seemingly, contradictory personalities in Russell Kirk and Martin Luther King. When I was growing up as a young college student, not so long ago, but somewhat long ago, it was pretty much commonplace that Martin Luther King was just a dangerous radical, a fraud, a conventional, a progressive, anti-American. And that was being taught from both the left and the right. And that was sort of our assumptions. We carried our baggages of assumptions just like the left carries their baggages of assumptions. And that I carried through for a lot of my life. And I know that two students then and now, progressive students and some conservative students, had the same view of Russell Kirk. They viewed him and his writings in kind of reductionist ways, and viewed him as a kind of a defender, a mindless defender of the status quo or of business interests, or et cetera, and dismissed him and labeled him without thinking. And that was happening in universities for many years. And that, I think, and for a variety of reasons, and John Wood will speak to this, that some of these silos are breaking down, and there's some opportunities for fresh thinking, and to look and to explore the ways in which Martin Luther King and Russell Kirk were in their way, in their particular way, in their particular traditions, with their emphases and their projects, still working within the same Christian, Western, and American tradition that aimed to recover and conserve and enliven those enduring norms and principles that Russell Kirk called the permanent things. And to strengthen, in fact, one of Dr. Kirk's favorite phrases to describe what he was doing all the time, what is he studying, what was the aim of his study, and he would say oftentimes it's to strengthen the American tradition of order and justice and freedom. And those concepts are big ideas, and they're all interrelated. And they are words and traditions and ideas that I think both preoccupied Martin Luther King and Russell Kirk. And to that end, I think while there's many differences, obviously, but it's an opportunity today to maybe look at some of the common ground that we have. And just saying that makes the whole concept tonight, the whole topic tonight, so interesting to me. I mean, I've been really looking forward to this event because, John Wood is one of the most exciting, humble but exciting, young thinkers. He's fresh, he's creative, he's really open and interested to ideas and currents across the spectrum, although he has his strong philosophical and intellectual ground. He's very good and capable of navigating the polarization, ideological and political polarization that is so prevalent today. He's breaking down barriers. A lot of times when I'm out talking to influential people like yourselves, friends, or just in coffee shops, they'll say, well, who are some of the young thinkers today, or who are some of the thinkers today that are kind of, we should know about, or saying fresh things, or, talking about some ideas that are a little, that we should know about that aren't as conventional. And I frequently comment that John Woods is one of those people you need to know. And John has been a leading force with Braver Angels. Some of you know Braver Angels. John is a national ambassador. John's a leading figure in the whole movement of depolarization, exploring within the Christian tradition and within sort of the left-right debates, ways to sort of ratchet the intensity down and find some ways in which to forge authentic common ground, genuine common ground, listening and understanding each other in ways that are difficult today. His group, Braver Angels, is the largest bipartisan grassroots organization dedicated to the work of depolarization. He's an opinion columnist for the USA Today. Prior to that, John was a nominee for Congress in California's 43rd District in the 2014 election cycle, afterwards serving as the second vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County, which is America's largest county-level Republican Party. He's a highly regarded speaker on matters of race and political reconciliation for reasons that you'll discover. He's a member of the Progress Network, an initiative of the New America Foundation dedicated to foster civilizational progress through thought leadership across the wide spectrum of views. A fellow builder with New Pluralists, a collaborative organization dedicated to civic bridge building and racial justice. With an advisor, he's an advisor also of the American Project, which is an initiative of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy dedicated to restoring communitarian roots of conservatism. John's a fresh and light. His star is ascending. He's got a very popular podcast, and young people talk about him everywhere I go. So it's really great to have him come all the way from Los Angeles on this rainy January night in Grand Rapids to be with us. To talk about Martin Luther King and Russell Kirk, a consensus of first principles. John.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all very much. I need to make a note to myself in general to tell the people who introduced me not to set the bar so high. At some point I may fail to clear it, but hopefully this is not one of those nights. No, but Jeff, it's great to be here with you. Great to see you again, Cecilia, Annette. So nice to see you, and new friends, Chris, Stephen. It's good to see you. And it's wonderful to be with all of you to talk about something that may seem like a counterintuitive sort of juxtaposition, right? This idea that the two most, let us say, catalytic figures of the mid-20th century in terms of spurring the movements that would go forward to define the further arc of American history, the conservative movement on the one hand, and you might say the civil rights movement, and within that the nonviolent movement, the mainstream of the American social justice movement of that era, which produced such indelible change, that these two individuals who you would instinctively assume would be polar opposites on the political spectrum, and in point of fact, they were, nevertheless were proceeding from a place of deep convergence with respect to the subterranean architecture, if you will, of the philosophies that they represented. And in so being the case, perhaps, just maybe, if we can sort of identify the places at which these individuals converged in meaningful ways, we might be able to restore unto ourselves in the present moment an understanding of how it is we might more effectively bridge the divide in our current time. Because I would argue, as you'll hear me do shortly, that both modern American social justice and modern American conservatism in many respects have lost their way. Because each tradition, I would suggest, has found itself, to greater or lesser degree, untethered from the deeper anchorings of virtue, of faith, of community, in their understandings of freedom, that for all of the political differences that existed between Dr. King and Russell Kirk, nevertheless represented sort of the deep soil from which the immense good that came from those movements sprung. So I can say a little bit by way of leading into that conversation, about how I sort of come to this topic. So I was speaking to a number of you earlier today about sort of how I come to conservatism, how I come to politics, broadly speaking. So I'm going to tell a story that I told to some of you folks earlier on, but there's a twist that comes at the end of it. So you can go to sleep for a moment if you heard me say this earlier, and then wake up at the punchline, or the punchline that follows the punchline. Jeff mentioned. Depending on which Jeff I'm talking to, I'll say other Jeff, but since both Jeffs are in the room, I will say Jeff without numerical designation. I was a nominee for Congress back in 2014. I actually ran against Maxine Waters in that election cycle. For anybody who doubts my commitment to, keeping the peace in the political battlefield. I was actually the most successful Democrat or Republican to ever run against Congresswoman Waters over the full arc of her now, I think, 54-year career in elected office. I lost in the smallest landslide of anybody who ever ran against the Congresswoman. Scratched the underside of 30%, which wasn't bad for a 26-year-old kid with no resume, no prior political experience. I didn't have much going for me in the way of money or sort of history in politics, but I knew the issues pretty well. I knew the community well, and I also had a story to tell. So the California 43rd is a very left-leaning sort of area, predominantly black and Latino, but with strong pockets of suburban conservatives, mostly white, some Asian. And so I had a bit of a canned opening line that I would roll out when I was speaking to folks, whether I was speaking to an audience at a Democratic-leaning black church in South Central Los Angeles, or to a white, predominantly white Tea Party club in South Bay LA County. People would always ask me, they'd say, what at the age of 26 makes you qualified to represent a district like, the California 43rd in LA? And I'd tell people, well, I come from an interesting family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my mother to my father to my mother, and that's why I can represent all of you. And it tended, there you go. And it tended to be good for a laugh. Now, the funny thing is I grew up, with political and racial diversity in my family, but the majority of my relatives were left-leaning. I grew up a liberal activist. I didn't start really studying conservatism until after having worked for the Obama campaign in 2008. I looked at Barack Obama as having echoed the high-minded moral social aims of Martin Luther King Jr. To me, the idea of hope and change suggested the post-partisan, post-racial America, neither red states nor blue states, but the United States, not black, white, or Latino America, but the United States of America. This idea of an America where we do not speak of white power or black power, but rather God's power and human power. That to me seemed to be the message that Barack Obama was echoing, and so I followed his campaign, worked for his campaign, and when it was all said and done, I took it upon myself to start studying conservatism in an effort to sort of bring Republicans and conservatives into the fold. Long story short, wound up sort of converting myself, but here's sort of the funny thing about how that ends, because I began taking in information from different places, reading books I hadn't read before, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, Atlas Shrugged. I read the Bible from cover to cover, had a religious conversion. That is its own story. It's very relevant to the tale here. Didn't really get to Russell Kirk until, honestly, after my 2014 campaign. And when I started reading Russell Kirk, I was struck, yes, by his philosophy, by, sort of who this man was in the context of American conservatism, the history thereof, the thinkers who he brought to my attention. But one in particular stood out to me just because I realized I had a little bit of a connection to Kirk and the story he was telling, just insofar as my name is John Randolph Wood Jr. I was named after my father, who was named after my grandfather, one Randolph Clay Wood, who happened to have been the founder and owner of America's biggest independent record label in the 1950s and early 60s, Dot Records. It was Pat Boone and Lawrence Welk and folks like that. And Grandpa was named after the great orators of the Senate, as my father explained to me when I was little. One of them being Henry Clay, and the other being John Randolph of Roanoke, who I knew nothing about until later on, after having run for Congress myself as a conservative in Los Angeles, realizing that I was actually named after one. That is to say, a man who sought congressional office by the name of John Randolph. And so I now somewhat proudly go by the moniker, at least when I'm speaking to my good friend Jeff Nelson, of John Randolph of South LA. And so, that's, that is a tag that I, happily embrace. But I'm somebody who thought of himself as growing up in Dr. King's promised land. Many people have explained to me how the United States of America is as racist today as it's ever been. But the truth is that I grew up in a time, in a place where I was deeply loved by people of very different skin colors and people of very different politics. It took me a while to realize that perhaps not all of America is that way. But it seemed that the power and impact of King's philosophy was one that genuinely did move the needle in terms of our national conscience and the way we treat each other as Americans. His legacy was well reported to me as a kid growing up in the public school system in Los Angeles. But one thing that was not particularly emphasized to me about King, though I knew he was a reverend, though clearly he was a religious man, was just how deep and just how vital King's understanding of society and the universe as proceeding from the mind and heart of an omnipotent creator was to his understanding of the power by which we affect social change in American life and in human life, broadly speaking. Dr. King was a person who believed in an ordered universe. I was a person who sought to dedicate myself to being a voice for King's philosophy without ever having quite been pointed to the fact that this was where his perspective began. And in reading Russell Kirk, one of the first things I lit upon was the idea that conservatism, in Kirk's view, is not really conservatism unless it proceeds from this assumption that we live in an ordered universe, that there is a design within which all things unfold. And that seemed to me like a striking harmony for two individuals that I knew lived in the same time, had different politics, and yet had launched these powerful movements that in different ways had seemed to come untethered from that starting point in some sense. That's the beginning of the similarity, not the end. Dr. King, in believing not just in God as an abstract fact, but in the idea that there's a creator that animates all things, believed that the nature of God was such that it must express itself in the human personality in order for us to effect change in society in ways that would be pleasing to that will. King believed in a God who is a God of love, that God is love, and to quote John in the first epistle of John, and that love is a spiritual force by which we can effect social transformation. But to love is to embody the virtues of love. And so the philosophy of nonviolence is a virtue philosophy. King's teachings centered in on the idea that love requires us to act in a spirit of goodwill towards our opponents, to regulate the way we think about our opponents so that we do not think wickedly about one another inwardly, and that in so doing we give ourselves the power to speak to the conscience of those who disagree with us. In believing that God is ordering the universe, it set the grounding for a higher level of human conduct in King's view, as well as a higher level of hope, a belief, a faith in the idea that ultimately, as has been amply quoted by President Obama and many, many others, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Kirk believed that we live in an ordered universe, that the station that we live in, that we occupy in life, is something of a divine tactic, a divine appointment, that the structures, the institutions of our society, the arrangements of our society, from age to age and generation to generation, are tied to one another in a dialogue that connects the past with the future. And each successive generation finds itself connected in a thread of destiny. And so he references, of course, in the conservative mind, Edmund Burke, who speaks of the spiritual unity of society, of humanity. And what does this cultivate in us? What does this instill in us? This idea that the design of human civilization as it proceeds from the Creator and is imperfectly implemented by man, that we should not be humble before redesigning things according to the limits of our own intelligence. That before we engage in the innovations of state power and democratic reforms with an effort to perfect all that we can observe as being imperfect, that we take our time to delineate, as I seem to recall Kirk writing, the divine contours within which society finds its arrangements, or the divine lineaments, perhaps was the phrase. And so it's interesting because we, of course, have to remember that, King is proceeding in his politics from a position of seeking to effect dramatic change in society. Kirk in his politics, the conservative movement that he inspired, is seeking to, I guess a colloquial way to put it would be something like, seeking to keep us from throwing the baby out with the bathwater. To remember that traditions and present social arrangements exist as they do for a reason, not because they always have to be in place in the way that they are, but that we ought not change a single thing until we understand why things are the way they are in the first place, and then proceed with prudence. So prudence is a virtue and a way of being and a way of understanding. But what's interesting about this is that even as King seeks to dramatically, in many respects, change and challenge the status quo of society, and even as Kirk seeks to root us in an appreciation for why things are the way that they are, they both have a criteria for how it is they pursue political reform or advocating for the maintenance of things as they are, that is rooted in virtue, that is rooted in humility and an understanding that there is a greater wisdom that calls us towards our actions and leaves us in our stations. And so what's the significance of that? For those who seek to change things in society, Dr. King brought a message of, yes, moral urgency during a time in which the immoral racial castes and hierarchies that were foisted upon society across the course of our history and that culminated in the social collisions of the 1960s. Yes, these were structures that he challenged, but he called upon his followers to engage the changing of those structures with love for those who sought to maintain them, and love for those who would challenge their own point of view and perspective as reformers. Dr. King called upon his followers to love the most rabid of their opponents. Because philosophical nonviolence, as much as people might want to make the case that Dr. King, on the left, people want to make the case that, Dr. King was in fact a radical. Dr. King was a social democrat. Dr. King was this, that, and the other. Yes, we know his politics were broadly speaking, liberal, although there are many conservative things about King. But King required those who would walk in his footsteps to honor the humanity of those whom they challenged, because King's goal was not the overthrow of American society or the overthrow of its traditions and its institutions, but rather a living up to the higher ideals of the American founding and an inclusion, the creation of a space of a democracy of genuine inclusion where white, black, left, and right, and all of us, regardless of our religious banners, could find ourselves in deep relationship with one another as co-members of the beloved community. This is something that you cannot do without Christian virtue, because you have to love your enemy. And so King proceeds from that tradition. The philosophy of King is not defined with respect to the philosophy of nonviolence. The overarching moral and spiritual philosophy of King is not defined by the particular political prescriptions he pursued, but rather by the greater anchoring in faith, in virtue, and a belief in the godly power of love that animated it, because philosophical nonviolence is a cast of mind. Just like the conservatism of Russell Kirk was a cast of mind. Yes, it may lead us to certain conclusions about policy in the context of the challenges of the moment. But I read through the conservative mind, and you go from Alexander Hamilton to John Randolph of Roanoke and others. It's hard to think of, certain people who would have less in common in terms of the prescriptions that they offered. But Kirk was calling upon us to be humble, to be prudent, to recognize the fact that there is greater wisdom that is setting in motion the currents of history in a way that would cause us to look at the arrangements of society and realize that if there are hierarchies, they are responding to genuine human needs. If there are structures and institutions which would seem to afford privileges to some and not to others, it does not mean that the remedy for this is a leveling of all things and the imposition of a forced sort of sameness. That change is inevitable, as Tocqueville understood, that change is inevitable. And one of the conclusions that Kirk records Tocqueville as coming to is the worrisome conclusion from his vantage point that the democratization of American society and society far beyond America's shores was so inexorable and yet so powerful that we ought to simply consider it a matter of divine providence. But that nevertheless, this movement of history is one that requires us to take a step back and to appreciate the wisdom that exists in the way things are. Now that gives us two different trajectories for how history flows, and yet they converge in harmony, and this is kind of the core of the case that I make in some sense. So Kirk discusses Alexis de Tocqueville, and Tocqueville says that while it seems to him inevitable that the democratization of humanity is something that will proceed without pause to those who would worry about its implications, that nevertheless it is not hopeless that man should succumb to the perversion of democracy, but rather that those who would be vigilant and critical of the tendencies of leveling innovations in democratic society to reduce the human being to one that seeks its gain only through the realization and the acquisition of material goods and positive rights without reference to a greater spiritual reality and a sense that we exist in the context of a design of society in which we find our purpose in relation to one another, that vigilance against that tendency is something that could allow for the democratization of American society and for Western civilization in general to not necessarily result in the hollowing out of the human soul. I would argue that Martin Luther King Jr., and as a matter of fact, I'm not even going to qualify the statement. I would argue that Martin Luther King Jr. represents the positive fulfillment of the type of small d Democrat that Alexis de Tocqueville was hoping for, and that whether or not Kirk would have recognized King as such in his own time, and I don't know, there really doesn't seem to be much record of Kirk having rendered commentary on King, or vice versa for that matter, that nevertheless, King was the type of democratic reformer that, if it is God's will that society should become more democratic, was needed to make sure that democratic process was still able to hearken back to the greater truths. Because one thing that you can read and hear King discussing, King emphasizing to those who walked with him in the effort towards integration in the civil rights movement was the fact that there is actually, although the terms are used interchangeably, he said, a deep and stark difference between integration and desegregation. Desegregation was something that King identified as being enforceable, important, something that the law could do to make sure that people were not unjustly barred in terms of their access to the resources and opportunities of society. But that's all the law can do. That's all desegregation can accomplish. If all we have is desegregation, King said that it leaves us in a society where we are elbow to elbow, but not heart to heart. That integration was what was required. Integration being one in which we recognize one another in the full sacredness of human personality, not forcing one another to be the same. King believed in an integration that highlighted the sanctity of human difference. And this obliteration of human difference is precisely what Burke and de Tocqueville and Kirk himself, a part of what they were concerned with in an industrial, materialistic, commercial society that eradicates what's special about the human individual in the arrangements that evolve over the course of time and in the context of the particular gifts that we bring to our station in life in relationship to one another. King was seeking to integrate into a society that recognized those things as special and sacred. He wanted those things for America, but he saw the American story as having traveled so woefully adrift from that starting point that, yes, he pursued a powerfully passionate and a morally aggressive and assertive path towards reform, which made him scary to many conservatives. You know, it's hard to know what exactly you're seeing in a man or a woman of action in the moment at which the consequences unfold in real time. The hindsight of history provides us some clarity. But what we can see in Dr. King's philosophy is that he was not trying to destroy the American project. He was trying to help redeem it, as was Kirk, who, like King, was alarmed at the creeping materialism of our corporate industrial society. It's not to cast aspersions on industry, of course. It is merely to say that the democratic impulse and the industrial commercial impulse, they're all things that cause us to find our salvation in things. But people are not things. This is what Dr. King said. And Dr. King and Edmund Burke, alike, as Kirk recounts, had a definition of the human being nearly identical to one another, which rested upon this understanding of freedom, that you cannot abstract freedom from the free man, from the free human being. Freedom is not a thing on the outside of me that I can acquire. The proper understanding of the human personality is that he is free by nature and that it is a perversion of things that limits freedom, that cuts off our freedom. They both saw freedom in this way because God intends for us ultimately to be free, and yet to be free within structure, to be free within limits. Burke and Kirk and King, King and Kirk and Burke all believed this as well. And so Dr. King spoke of the freedom of the will, he spoke of choice, but he said that God's providence is supreme, that what we have is the freedom to choose according to our destined nature. Right? And so even as conservatism, rightly understood, emphasizes freedom, it is freedom within the context of a greater reverence for God's design and the reason for the things around us. the reason for the things around us and the things within us. So, in my reflections on these men, on the philosophies that they inspired, I find myself feeling a bit of reverence and humility myself for the greater mind of God. Forgive me if I sound a bit like a preacher at this point. But it's just to say that the nature of our politics, our small-minded political tribalism, is such that we cast all things as zero-sum competitions in the context of our disagreements, to the point at which your existence and mine, if our politics are different, are themselves a zero-sum conflict. And this is the path to violence. This is the path to destruction. When I tell myself that I cannot live with you because I disagree with you, because we see things different ways, right? It also represents a forgetting of Christian wisdom in the deepest and most poignant ways. The truth is that if Russell Kirk and Martin Luther King Jr. were sitting here today, they still probably would disagree on all sorts of things. You know, Russell Kirk was a great champion for Barry Goldwater. Dr. King considered Barry Goldwater the most dangerous man in America. The battles between that generation of Americans were real. And yet, truth and wisdom are transcendent. Love is transcendent because God is. There was good in each of these men. There was wisdom in each of these men. And an America that believes in more than material things or ideological things is an America that can recognize the fact that truth is not the mere property of one political tribe or the other. It comes from a faith that is seasoned by human experience. And so Kirk, in writing about Edmund Burke, makes reference to the fact that while this was a man who sees society as being ordered by a creator, that this is no impractical mystic, but a man whose spirituality is wedded to understanding and encountering reality as it is. It proceeds from an understanding of what is concrete and real in human relationships, and does not give in to the flights of fancy that say that I, as one intellectual, as one person with an IQ of, I'm not saying this is my IQ, but as one person with an IQ of 150 or an SAT score of 1600 or what have you, has the answers to life's eternal mysteries or to the problems of political society. By no means. He had a high-minded spirituality, Edmund Burke, according to Russell Kirk, but it was one that was calibrated to respond to the realities of real challenges. That could be said about Martin Luther King. If we can come to a place to where, on the left and the right, we can revive a commitment to virtue, a commitment to community, a deeper understanding, shared understanding of freedom, the sanctity of the human person, a rejection of mere materialism as a pathway to human flourishing, as important as material things are, and a remembrance of the fact that left or right, we are children of God and derive the sanctity of our persons from the love that He bears for us, then maybe, just maybe, our conflicts no longer have to be quite so zero-sum. We can learn to live with each other more fully again in a deeper vision of what America could be, an America of the beloved community, tied together with every generation of our forebears, linking us forward to our descendants in the thread of destiny, and realize the fact that we can believe in America and honor the wisdom of Russell Kirk and Martin Luther King. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I hope that I cleared the bar, more or less. Thank you all. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for your.
It's on. It's on.
I can hear you.
Thank you so much for your talk, which had many areas of inspiration. What occurred to me as you were speaking, when you spoke of virtue and you spoke of an ordered universe and God, I recalled Jesus, in which he was saying, "I came to free the oppressed. I came to release the prisoners." And the way he was doing that was through the power of his love.
Yeah.
Love one another as I've loved you. Do you think that that was really what was elemental, about Dr. King's mission? That it wasn't just about the social changes, although that was important, that was extremely important, no question. But that elementally, even deeper, it was this freedom that you speak of, in which, the unvirtuous, the person unable to live out virtue, is a prisoner. They're in chains. And it isn't restricted, or maybe it even, I don't think it was restricted at that time, most certainly, to any particular race, but maybe even more so now. It's a question of what is freedom, and do you think that that's more elemental in what his message was, is that freedom for all, from this being captured by this slavery of, lack of a better word, sin?
Yes, absolutely. I believe that that is essentially sort of the first principle of King, really. I mean, he is, through a godly love, he is seeking freedom on every level. He is concerned with the material dimension of human life, but ultimately, he's seeking the spiritual liberation that only comes with finding yourself in right relationship with your fellow man and, with the source that begets us, right? And, King was very clear about this, really, He said what we seek is the beloved community. We seek not to defeat or humiliate our opponents, but to be reconciled to them in friendship, so that we may be with each other in the beloved community, right? It was a vision, of heaven on earth. It was a vision of the kingdom of God, or some approximation of that in some sense. That's what King saw in his mind, in his heart, And Edmund Burke, who believed in, Burke had a vision, sort of an Anglican church that was threaded throughout the fabric of institutional society, that wedded its institutions in direct relationship to a reverential sort of understanding of the spiritual contours in which we have the existence of the state. And so, in the context of British society and this sort of constitutional tradition with which he was familiar, that's sort of the mechanical way, I think, by which Burke sort of envisioned a similar sort of outcome manifesting. And indeed, Russell Kirk makes reference to someone who I now forget who the quote is attributed to, but the statement in the conservative mind there is that Burke is sort of, I think, less concerned with one form of government or other, but rather with building something like the kingdom of heaven on earth. Folks will correct me on the details of that imperfect recollection. But the short answer to your question is simply yes.
First of all, thank you. That was an amazing speech. You delivered it very well. I wholeheartedly agree with your conclusions.
Thank you.
My question has to do more with an action sense, and bear with me as I wrote this down so that I could remember it. In our modern social construct, where the idea of the omnipotent director is being assailed on the one side by a new atheism that espouses selfishness as a virtue, and on the other by a progressive Christianity that redefines love as tolerance, absent correction or admonition, what would your suggestion be, and how to apply your conclusions to this willfully self-righteous society?
Well, and of course, I agree with both of those forces that you've identified as pushing back against our ability to realize this consciousness. And I could add to that list, the thing to add to that list is, in my humble opinion, a religiosity in American culture, society, and politics that is itself unconcerned with the virtues that ought to be definitive of what it means to be religious, and certainly to be Christian. The sort of religion whose merit in certain people's eyes is proven by your political positions more than by the fruits of the Spirit, right? And that, in many respects, is more dangerous because it presents a false understanding of what religion is that justifies not believing in it, you know? But to your point, I do believe that, so, you know, the late Christopher Hitchens, famously a new atheist, somebody who was a remarkably entertaining polemicist. Very little respect, of course, for religion in general, but there are a few religious people who he respected and a few who he saw as demonstrating in his opinion, sort of the rare but occasionally, you know, found positive power of faith. And King was somebody who he pointed to directly as showing what a Christian should be, even while he felt that the category of Christianity was an illegitimate one. And it's because King and his actions, regardless of where they derive from in his beliefs, according to Hitchens, nevertheless plainly demonstrated a moral capacity for transforming people into their better selves and scaling that impact up in society. All we really have to do is consult the scripture, really. And again, I'm going to sound like a preacher here, you know? You don't have to be a self-understood Christian, though, to benefit from the wisdom of the Gospels. And what the Gospels and what the Bible, you know, teaches us ultimately is that you know, we are to be judged by the fruits of the Spirit, by the fruit of the tree of righteousness, right? And that ultimately, Jesus says to those who doubt his words, believe me not for the words that I speak then, but for the works that I do. We have to do things that demonstrate the personality of God. It's in our conduct. It is in virtue that we can show the power of what the Spirit can do. Not of us, but because we believe in it, we receive it, and it animates our actions. That's the way the circuitry works, you know? That's sort of the mechanics of it. As long as, this kind of goes back to the old Jack Kemp saying, I think it's attributed to him, right? You know, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. There's something similar to that. Intellectual arguments on behalf of the existence of God, I actually think are important, but they're woefully insufficient in the absence of the power of the Spirit, you know? And that's what King demonstrated. You can use that in politics because it is more powerful than politics.
John, thank you. A question for you. With today's current polarization, if you could be the architect of its mitigation, what would be your strategy?
Well, so I mean that's that's sort of a shop talk question for me, Chris, given what I do. So forgive me. I guess I'll take a moment to turn that into something of a commercial for what it is I do and what it is we do. So Braver Angels is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization, but I tend to like to deepen that by saying what we are really committed to is reviving the communal fabric of American democracy. We're not explicitly a faith-based organization. There are folks of many faiths and no particular religious faith in Braver Angels. But I think we have in our coalition of members and partner organizations something in common that Dr. King identified as being a common thread for all those who believed in and worked within the nonviolent movement, even if they were not people of religious faith. And that was nevertheless a faith in the transformational power of agape love, of goodwill to change human hearts and to move society towards the ethical plane. I think that's what unites us at Braver Angels. And we do a great number of things. We're a national community of practice, right now about 12,000 members strong, about 85 or so local bipartisan alliances, you can think of them as chapters, with programs ranging from Congress to the kitchen table. Our very first workshop, so we have all sorts of ways of convening the American people. The very first one we developed by Professor William Doherty, co-founder of Braver Angels from the University of Minnesota, a foremost family therapist and psychologist, was one in which we brought together small numbers of folks from the right and from the left, reds and blues, as we say in-house, not to argue or debate politics, but to speak from the vantage point of their own life experiences in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. It's literally marriage counseling for Republicans and Democrats. That's what it is, That was our first workshop, but since then, we've developed many, many more methods and techniques. We have workshops and courses aimed at helping people develop actual rhetorical skills for being able to communicate empathetically and in a depolarizing fashion across the divide. We have workshops aimed at helping people get in touch with their own inner dialogue and not let that, that devilish little voice inside of you that always wants to say the nastiest thing about people you don't know, sort of keep that voice from getting traction. We have an extremely popular debate program designed by April Lawson, my colleague and formerly of the New York Times and the Aspen Institute, which is cultivating a context for debate on college campuses and local communities that is oriented around the pursuit of truth, framed around the pursuit of truth, rather than just owning the libs or destroying the conservatives. But what each of these things are doing are giving people skills and habits, new norms birthed out of relationships people oftentimes never expected to have, people who think differently from them, or repaired relationships with people who they thought had lost forever, parents who think that their kids will never respect them again because they voted for Trump, or couples on the brink of divorce. We build relationships that generate norms that people then take back with them out across the spectrum and landscape of American institutions and communities, back with them to their local governments, back with them to their office, back with them to their class, back with them to their neighborhood, back with them to their kitchen table. And in so doing, they become a part of the larger story of an America united, or an America striving towards the beloved community that Braver Angels, with our partners and media platforms and supporters, seek to tell to the broader body politic. We seek to share a vision of what America could be, and this is my way of saying it here right now, but if we were to honor the wisdom of Dr. King and Russell Kirk, and a commitment to the interpersonal virtues, and an understanding of what democracy could be if we genuinely had a respect and reverence for the sanctity of the human person, regardless of their politics. We tell that story, people become a part of our community, they learn how to move that way of being forward, and they in turn become a part of the story that we tell. And that story and those methods are touching every major institution in American life, or at least every major sector in American life, and we are just getting started. And so I very much invite any and everybody who sees the value in this project to potentially get involved. And so, am I about to get the hook? I guess that's my time, folks. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, our promise was to formally end it at 8, but it is not the end of the program. We do have some food and refreshments in the back. We hope you'll continue the conversation. Final thank you again to the Russell Kirk Center for being part of this event, for helping to lead and propose the event, actually. And to all of you for participating, and to our online audience, thank you, and we look forward to the next opportunity.